pleased to have you here. Normally I wait till about 9:05 so people can get off the metro, but you're all so quiet and attentive and ready to go, we might as well get started. I know there are some new people here, and I'm going to try out some new language that it's experimental language that the Center's putting together on what we do. But just let me read it out. The Woodrow Wilson Center fosters policy-relevant research and dialogue to enhance the knowledge and capability of institutions, leaders, and citizens worldwide. As a neutral public forum, we support research by staff and visiting scholars and practitioners, host conferences and meetings in Washington and elsewhere, and extend these discussions through broadcasting, publication, and internet media. Created by an act of Congress as the National Living Memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, the Center is a nonpartisan institution supported by public and private funds. And in that vein, I'm very pleased to welcome 4 academics who I've known for a while who have lots to say on the Canada-U.S. relationship. First, the authors of the book in question today, the Canada-United States, Ambivalent Allies, Steve Randall from the University of Calgary and John Thompson from Duke University. And 2 friends from a long time, Scott C. from the University of Maine and Don Abelson from the University of Western Ontario. Working backwards along the line here, Don is, if I want to get this right, he's Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center for American Studies at the University of Western Ontario. There are very few centers of American United States studies in Canada. Don has a very good one, and it's I'm serve on their advisory board, so, but no, really, it's trying to get Canadians to understand more about the United States than they think they already know. Next, Scott C. is the Lieber Professor of History and former chair of the University of Maine's History Department. He's on sabbatical this year after a long time as head of the department there, and he's working on some long-term research on ethnicity and collective violence in 19th century British North America. John Thompson, I'm not going to read his cheeky biography, but you have it in front of you. But he's chair of Duke. He was chair of Duke's History Department. I think he happily left that, and was director of Duke's Canadian Studies and North American Studies program. And as he said in his biography, I also like to say, John, that I think it is the standard work in this, which is why I'm delighted to have you here. Steve Randall, on the far end, is Professor of History and Director of the University of Calgary's Institute for United States Policy Research. And if I'm going to be honest with Don, I have to be honest with Steve that I'm also on the advisory board there. He was Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, and his most recent project, I think, is the authorized biography of Alfonso Lopez Michelson, Su vida, su época, who was a former president of Colombia. We are going to go in John, Steve, Don, and Scott. We are also filming this, not for live webcast, but for archival purposes. We will put it up on the web soon, so that if your colleagues didn't get to see it, they can see it, or if you missed something, it'll be up there later. But I would ask you to turn off BlackBerries and cell phones, because you get this kind of squeaky electronic interference that messes with the sound and the transmission of that. So I'm grateful for that. We have plenty of time for discussion after this, and I turn it over to John.
Thank you all very much for coming this morning. I guess I was the last person to arrive. I apologize for being late. I realized something that's happened in the however many years this. When was the first edition published, Steve? 1992. 1992. I realized one of the things that's happened in those 16 years, I've become much slower. It now takes me much longer to walk from the George Washington University Inn to this area of town than it used to take me back then. I also realized that I've forgotten what people actually wear in Washington. I was thinking I was at the high end of campus couture, but I seem to have lost that. I'm speaking first because I'm the author who wrote the parts of the book that are probably the least policy relevant, and I don't want to get in the way of discussions among people who want to talk about U.S.-Canada interactions. I'm just going to speak briefly about the things that have changed in the 4th edition from the 1st edition. And of course, this is the first time we had a chance to really take the whole book apart. In the 2nd and 3rd editions, we sort of added on. Think of, a do-it-yourself or a bricoleur putting a deck on the back of her house. We tacked on chapters and played with the last chapters, but for this one, we took it apart right from the beginning to the end. It's my understanding that the book is used as much in political science courses or more in political science courses as a general narrative than it is used in history courses. But for the 5 or 6 historians, no one's gleaming. In any event, Scott will notice that we've been able to incorporate the material that historians have generated since the early 1990s into this book. And so we've compressed the middle, expanded the beginning, and followed our traditional pattern of adding a new chapter. And I want to thank President George W. Bush for giving us so much good material to work with. It's very difficult to write contemporary history. I looked for a quotation about contemporary history, and I found one from Arnold Toynbee. And Toynbee said, "The writer of contemporary history is like the, let's make it a woman, is like the woman with her nose pressed against the mirror trying to see her whole body." It's very difficult. And each time in 1996 and 2002, when we took the end of the previous edition apart, the hardest part was projecting, figuring out what was going to happen and where the relationship was going. And of course, we're used to hearing grand pronouncements about how this is the darkest moment ever for Canadian-American relations, or wow, everything's wonderful, there's no problems at all, eh? And so it's tricky to fine-tune these things. I'm sure we're meeting here now with a sense of excitement and crisis. And nice gentleman who did his degree at McGill, writes for the Washington Post. Wrote 2 weeks ago that Charles Krauthammer wrote 2 weeks ago that historians were going to say that George Bush was one of our greatest presidents because he met all kinds of problems. And I'm very excited. I'm looking forward to the 5th edition to see if I actually get to say that. And I'm going to stop.
Okay. Leaving everything to me, John. Thank you. I'm also very pleased to be here, and David, thank you very much for the invitation. I think that's an excellent opportunity for us to explore some of the aspects in U.S. foreign policy and Canadian-American relations. And to, I guess, a large extent, although it's very difficult to tell who wrote what in the book now after the last 15 or 16 years of working on this, but I guess I'm primarily responsible for the U.S. foreign policy aspect, so you can blame me for misinterpretations or interpretations, as the case may be. I think there are a number of things that I would like to do differently, and things that I think are challenging still. I'm currently teaching a course, and have for many years, on U.S. foreign policy, which is explicitly structured to have half history and half political science students. I think Chuck would appreciate this in many respects. The history students are unhappy that there's too much political science, and the political science students are unhappy that there's too much history. But I think that does raise the constant issue of the differences or similarities between the two disciplines. And I think we've tried in the book to be somewhat theoretical, but not entirely, I think, successfully. And I want to explore that a little bit, along with touching on some more substantive issues. And that's the challenge of a sustained theoretical model in the book. One of the real challenges I think we faced with each of these editions of Ambivalent Allies has been identifying a consistent pattern or a consistent set of characteristics of United States policy toward Canada. And I'm very interested in hearing both what our commentators and members of the audience have to say on this issue. When we use the term ambivalent in the title, our reference is primarily to Canadian foreign policy, or Canadian policy toward the United States. But how should we characterize in general, and this has been a challenge I think that has eluded us, how should we characterize in general U.S. policy toward Canada? The volume deals with episodes, typical historical approach with specific policy issues, things such as trade, border security, Arctic sovereignty, missile defense, the Afghanistan and Iraq situation more currently, as well as what I think are an interesting range of issues on culture and values. It's not difficult to determine what a range of U.S. administrations have expected of Canada on those issues historically, and especially since 1945. But is there a general and meaningful way to characterize U.S. policy toward Canada, let's say since 1945? Other scholars have written about a policy of neglect, of indifference, about Canada being, and I'm thinking of Mahant and Mount here, obviously, of Canada being inaudible and invisible in Washington. But I'm not sure that such notions are really helpful in identifying the nature of American policy. I also don't think, and John and I say this in the book, that the old notion of a special relationship is terribly helpful, since there are so many special relationships, Mexico, England, Australia, if you go through the literature, they all claim the same thing. The terms become meaningless. So where does that leave us? One might consider a policy of expectation. That is, that Canada is a close ally, major trading partner, significant source of energy requirements, and coming from Alberta, I have to say that, with many cultural similarities and values, with due respect to Michael Adams, is expected by Washington policymakers to be supportive when called upon, especially in times of crisis. There's irritation, sometimes bewilderment in Washington when Canada doesn't step up to the plate in a manner that's expected. Think of Kennedy and Diefenbaker in the Cuban Missile Crisis, Pearson speech at Temple University on Vietnam, Trudeau's peace initiative toward the end of his government, the very strained relationship between Chrétien and Bush, Paul Martin on the issue of missile defense. So Canada has been expected to be, and in most instances, has been a like-minded nation, but not always. And there have been some very bewildered, I think, as well as critical responses in Washington. Nor have U.S. officials been, shall we say, particularly happy by Canadian politicians, who in most elections, the most recent one, I think, is an exception, who find American bashing a convenient way to deal with domestic Canadian political issues. And a number of U.S. officials have said to me, and I'm sure to many others over the last 5 or 6 years, that just has to stop. I mean, it's using anti-Americanism as a political tool in the Canadian context really has become somewhat passé. But when you look at concrete policy issues, in the case of Lord Axworthy, for example, the position on the International Criminal Court, the Landmines Treaty, the whole issue of soft power, of human security. John Hamray, and I think we quote him in the book, formerly, of course, with the Department of Defense, said that human security and soft power are meaningless concepts, that the only thing that counts are boots on the ground. Fundamental differences, in other words, in policy. Is that a value difference or is it a policy difference? And I think the distinction between the two is something we need to talk about. There's also been a reasonably consistent Washington assumption since at least the end of the Second World War, if not earlier, that the North American continent is a single unit in terms of security, natural resource development, markets, and investment. One could possibly include Mexico in that, but let's stick to the Canadian-American relationship. And that Canada should not be throwing up obstacles to that borderless condition, whether it's in the economic, the strategic, or in the cultural realm, culture being, of course, theoretically off the table in the free trade agreement discussions. And since 9/11, I think we all know in this room, the U.S. view of the need for North American perimeter defense, border security, is a logical extension of those earlier views. But it is an extension of an earlier view. The State Department official may have exaggerated when he wrote in 1948, at the time of the aborted free trade agreement, Mackenzie King, that knitting the two countries together, and I quote, had been an objective of U.S. foreign policy since the founding of the Republic. Now, it may have been an exaggeration, but there have always been many Canadians who believe that that was the U.S. goal, rightly or wrongly. A more recent expectation on the part of U.S. policymakers, not an unreasonable one, has been that political figures stop using anti-Americanism as a political club, as I mentioned before. In terms of an overriding theoretical model to help us understand where Canada fits in U.S. policy, John and I have toyed, and I use that term advisedly because we're not consistent with the notion of world systems analysis. And to some extent, I think that does help us to place Canada into the worldview of U.S. policymakers, certainly since 1945. A worldview that, at least since Woodrow Wilson, and appropriate for this environment, has been driven by national security concerns, the desire to promote a liberal international world order, open markets for trade and investment, open borders, limited state intervention in the private sector, and democratic political institutions. And I think that characterizes U.S. policy. The bilateral relationship has, therefore, I would argue, reflected the applicability of some degree of both the realist and the liberal internationalist school in international relations theory. In other words, in terms of U.S. policy in general, and specifically toward Canada, U.S. policymakers have been rational, self-interested actors who've sought to maximize the national interest. The realist model works in the sense that it's premised on the assumption that some degree of conflict among states is the norm. The liberal internationalist concept works in the sense that it's premised on the notion that cooperation is also feasible. I think that what we've stressed in the volume is that significant as the bilateral relationship is, and it's obviously tremendously significant in economic and in security terms, in trying to understand that relationship, I think we're still better advised to try to understand U.S. policy toward Canada, not simply in those bilateral terms, but rather as part of the general goals, values, and priorities of U.S. foreign policy. In other words, bilateral studies have the same problems as case studies. They don't capture the broader picture. A third area where I think we might have been more analytical and systematic is in our treatment of the structure of foreign policy making in the two countries, the relative importance of the executive, legislature, various branches of the executive. We know, for instance, that since at least Ellen Gottlieb's ambassadorship in the Mulroney years, and later, of course, Derek Burney, there's been considerable Canadian focus on Congress, less on the executive. But we rarely, in our book, we rarely talk about Congress. We rarely talk about the Canadian Parliament. And what does that mean about the nature of foreign policy making? I think it's an interesting question. What impact, if any, did they have on such issues, and do have on such issues as trade policy? I think a very important one. On the Canadian side of policy making, I think we could also do more to clarify the often shifting balance of power among various divisions of the Canadian government in policy making toward the United States. Department of Foreign Affairs, National Defense, the Privy Council, the Prime Minister's foreign policy advisors, Department of Finance. Currently, to illustrate the point, the National Security Advisor in the Privy Council office provides advice to the Prime Minister on security issues. Foreign Policy Advisor in the PCO not only serves as a coordinating role among the federal departments and agencies on bilateral relations, but also communicates directly with the White House and U.S. Embassy officials in Ottawa. Institutional engagement across the border also goes well beyond what officials in Ottawa and Washington do. Gottlieb captured the complexity, I think, of the bilateral context most effectively when he wrote in his memoirs, and I quote, "The relationship is driven by hundreds of institutions and organizations in both the national and provincial capitals, each interacting with points of contact south of the border," end of quote. There have been times as well when the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade was clearly the dominant force. Other times, in driving Canadian policy, other times policy has clearly been driven by the Prime Minister's office. If one takes the case, for instance, of the free trade negotiations in the 1980s, we know that finance on the Canadian side and Treasury on the U.S. played crucial roles, but there would unlikely have been success had it not been for the active engagement of the Prime Minister and the President. The latter, to a lesser extent, I think, that is Reagan. And this is also true, I believe, of the resolution of the acid rain dispute, which very heavily involved the Prime Minister's office and Reagan to a considerable extent as well. We also know that there are different perspectives within departments. As, for instance, the perhaps exaggerated notion that external affairs is divided between the bilateralists and the multilateralists, or to use Ellen Gottlieb's terms, the realists and the romantics. A term I don't like, but it's his. Those who, on the one hand, want Canada to give primary attention to making the U.S. relationship work, and those who contend that Canada's national interests lie more clearly in offsetting the power and influence of the United States, the approach that Lloyd Axworthy clearly, I think, took, at least during the years that he was foreign minister. The internal structure of the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade and the ways in which that structure has evolved also reflect to a considerable extent the degree of importance placed on relations with the United States. In 1982, and Gillian Dowding and I are doing a paper for the Department of Foreign Affairs for their 100th anniversary currently. There was no interdepartmental cabinet-level committee that was responsible for coordinating policy with the United States. Nothing. At that time, there were 7 separate divisions within the Department of Foreign Affairs that had some responsibility for relations with the United States. Those divisions reported to 3 different assistant deputy ministers, 2 deputy ministers, and 2 different ministers. Now, that did change in 1983 when Derek Burney was appointed assistant deputy minister for the United States, but I think it's a clear indication of, shall we say, the bureaucratic politics paradigm as well in the making of foreign policy. It was confusion. I mean, confusion reigned. Not to belabor these points, I would only like to suggest that there are other ways, in other words, in which we might have approached our analysis of the bilateral relationship. But what we've strived for, and I hope achieved, is a volume that provides a comprehensive historical narrative of the way in which 2 nations, often but not always agreeing, but still driven to a large extent by common values and shared goals, have come to terms with the political, economic, strategical, and cultural forces that have confronted the world over the past 2 centuries. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And let me join my colleagues in thanking all of you for coming this morning, and to thank David Biet and Ken Christ and others at the Woodrow Wilson Center for organizing this important event. I'm certainly delighted to be here. I was here about a year and a half ago talking about the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative, and it's one issue that I suspect won't go away depending on, or regardless of who occupies the White House in the next little while. It's just one of the many issues that I'm going to touch on. We were very fortunate to have Professor Randall and Professor Thompson's book to guide us through the often complex and multi-layered relationship between Canada and the United States, and I certainly applaud their efforts to provide us with a very thoughtful and comprehensive blueprint from which to peer into the past and look into the future. As I was going through the book for the second or third time, I've seen many of the editions and was very happy with the changes that were made in this most recent edition. It kind of reminded me of an all-you-can-eat buffet, because you can go through, whether it's the first couple of chapters or the middle or the end, and you can find something that's going to be of interest. If you're interested in the relationship between our leaders, between Canadian prime ministers and American presidents, there's a lot to focus on. If you're interested in the role that cultural values play in defining the nature of the relationship, there's a lot there too. So you can pick and choose, and it's something that you're going to go back to time and time again for fresh insights, and more importantly, the historical narrative that I think will help shape our understanding of some very important current events. You certainly don't need me to tell you that over the last several months in your own presidential election, there has been a great deal of discussion about the need for change. All right, it's defined the Obama camp. John McCain has talked a lot about the politics of change. And they're not only talking about changing the political machinery in Washington, but they're talking about changing the way that we Americans primarily relate to the United States. As you know, in Canada, and this might be a surprise to some of you, there's an election going on. We haven't heard a whole lot about it, but we are in the process of electing a new government. We don't know if that change will result in a minority to a majority government or a change in leadership, but we will know certainly after Canadian Thanksgiving. As important elections are taking place in our 2 countries, we also need to think about whether our bilateral relationship needs to undergo some change. Over the past several years, a number of issues ranging from the ongoing war in Afghanistan to the implementation of the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative to claims about Arctic sovereignty and concerns about trade have dominated discussions between policymakers in our 2 countries. At times, as Professor Thompson and Professor Randall point out, this has led to serious disagreements. At other times, to close cooperation. Canada and the United States may indeed be ambivalent allies and may remain ambivalent allies, but on some issues, including Arctic sovereignty, WHTI, and others, they have made their case clearly and decisively. And in some of those instances, including increased border security, it's highly unlikely that this is going to disappear from the bilateral agenda. There might be a different approach depending on who occupies 24 Sussex and who occupies the White House in the near future, but the issue of smart borders and border security certainly will not disappear. the case of Arctic sovereignty, and I was delighted that our two authors spent a fair bit of time getting into some of the controversial aspects of Arctic sovereignty. My university and my center, the Center for American Studies, well, not mine, but the one that I have the privilege of overseeing, hosted an event last year, a year and a half ago, and we had Ambassador David Wilkins, U.S. Ambassador to Canada, along with Alan Gottlieb and others. And we had a distinguished panel of journalists, including Jeffrey Simpson and Andrew Cohen, and tons of TV cameras were there. And the only issue that became headline news the next day was a comment that David Wilkins made about Arctic sovereignty, not accepting the Canadian government's claim to having sovereignty in that particular area. And that was an issue that Prime Minister Harper seized on the next day and became front page news for a few days. That also is a very important issue. Let's talk about what's going on now, both the election in the United States and in Canada. By most accounts, and as a political scientist I do have to comment on this, the majority of Canadians, or a majority of Canadians, would prefer to see Barack Obama in the Oval Office, assuming, of course, he does not decide to abrogate the NAFTA, which a good colleague and friend of mine, Ian Brody, knows all too well about. Canadians would like to see a leader who is less militaristic. I don't think there's any doubt about that. A leader that is more willing to build bridges with foreign countries. And again, you certainly don't need me to remind you that the next president of the United States is going to have to devote a fair bit of time to not only repairing but restoring strong ties with many countries around the world. I think Canadians would prefer to see a more cultured, and in parentheses I have more intellectual leader, one who is more open to suggestions from allies about how to promote a more secure world order, and as well a leader who is sensitive to cultural differences. Put simply, Canadians would like to see American leaders, or an American leader who is a mirror image of themselves. And for those of you who have spent a fair bit of time looking at the anti-federalist Federalist debates back in 1787, you'll be very familiar with the debate about whether or not leaders should be on a long leash or a short leash, whether or not leaders should represent the interests of their constituents or the interests of the country as a whole. And I think Canadians often would like to see American leaders who look a whole lot more like them and share very similar values to them. Problem is, easier said than done. As Professors Randall and Thompson point out, we cannot afford to overlook two major considerations in studying the nature or the relationship between Canada and the United States. First, despite a larger landmass, we do have a larger landmass, we have 1/10 your population, a fraction of your GDP, and of course, in terms of military strength, ours pales in comparison. Ours is not a relationship of mutual dependence, despite the fact that Canada is the largest export market for 39 U.S. states. Ours is a relationship based on asymmetrical interdependence. We enjoy a healthy trade relationship, so healthy, in fact, that it exceeds over $500 billion a year. We share a 5,500-mile-long border, and there was an interesting discussion in the book about whether or not the concept of the longest undefended border in the world is still appropriate, and I know that both authors weighed heavily into that particular concept. But in terms of a balance of power, there isn't one. That the United States will always be a much stronger power and will always be in a position where it will dictate the terms of the relationship. As Prime Minister Trudeau once said, we are the mouse living beside the elephant. What is interesting, and getting to the second point that our two authors make, is that there has always been far more interest in Canada about what takes place in the United States than in the United States about what takes place in Canada. But ironically, if you go to the Canadian Embassy website in Washington, you will notice that there are probably 50 to 54 Canadian Studies centers / programs / ongoing activities at major American universities in the U.S. And in Canada, we have a fraction of the number of centers devoted to the study of the United States. One of the efforts that the Fulbright Foundation has made over the last number of years is to try and promote American studies in Canada. The Center for American Studies at Western is one of the few universities in Canada that offers a 4-year undergraduate degree in American Studies, focusing on Canada-U.S. relations and on U.S. cultural, political, and social history. So why is it that despite the fact that we struggle for airtime in the United States as Canadians, there's so much more academic interest in the United States about Canada than in Canada about the United States? And I think part of the problem is that in Canada we've become all too smug. We claim to know so much about the United States that we don't have to learn anything more. One of the many obstacles I faced in trying to restore the center or rebuild the center at Western was the complaint that why do we need to know more about the United States? Don't we know enough? Well, clearly we don't. I think one of the major mistakes that both Canadian policymakers and members of the attentive public made in the aftermath of 9/11, and perhaps we can talk about this a bit more, is that we underestimated, and I would point out grossly underestimated, the psychological impact that 9/11 had on the United States. So although we were quick to provide support in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, as time dragged on, we became, I think, less willing to support U.S. security initiatives. We became more critical of the Bush administration's posture, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly. But I think we continue to underestimate the impact that that particular event, historic event, had on the American people. It's just one of many examples where we think we know a whole lot more than we do, and it leads to miscommunication and misunderstanding. So where do we go from here? How do we peer into our crystal ball and forecast the future of the Canadian-American relationship? And every time I think about the relationship between our two countries, I often think about the Bill Murray movie, Groundhog Day. It's like the same scene plays out time and time again in my head. We have good relations for a while. Leaders get along. They're ideologically compatible, a Stephen Harper and a George W. Bush, a Brian Mulroney and a Ronald Reagan and a George Bush. And then we enter periods of intense conflict, a Pierre Trudeau and a Richard Nixon, a Pierre Trudeau and a Ronald Reagan, a Jean Chrétien and a George W. Bush. But it's the same scene that plays out time and time again. And I think one of the things that we as historians and political scientists have to think about is how do we change the dynamic? So when we talk about change, we obviously can have positive change and we can have negative change. But how do we change the dynamic between the two countries? And let me conclude my brief remarks by making a few very naive observations. So I don't know if although I've been trained in the realist tradition, if, as Alan Gottlieb pointed out, he would relegate me to the romanticist camp. But let me just throw this out. In an ideal world, I think both countries would follow a very simple strategy in terms of dealing with each other. Canadian policymakers and the people they represent need to knock the inferiority chip off their own shoulders. Canada has much to be proud of in the fields of energy, education, science and technology, healthcare, border security, and much to contribute on the bilateral and multilateral front. I think our history attests to that. But Canadians also have to be less smug and arrogant with respect and to the United States. It's one thing to criticize U.S. leadership in foreign policy, and we have clearly done that in the past, as have many of our allies. But it's another thing to be dismissive and condescending. That does not serve our interests well. It does not serve the bilateral relationship well, nor does it serve the interests of the international community. We have to stop, as several policymakers have done in the past, making disparaging comments about American leadership. There's a time for that, but it's not before the cameras. That must change. American policymakers, on the other hand, I think need to temper their power with a sense of humility. One of the caricatures of President Bush that has resonated strongly with me over the last number of years, and in fact it was an image that appeared on the front cover of the New Yorker magazine several years ago, was a picture of the president riding a horse into the sunset. And the horse turns around to look at the president, and the president is the one wearing the blinders, looking at it. Do you really know where you're going? We know, and you don't have to be a critic of the Bush administration to point this out, that this has been one of the most closed foreign policy administrations that your country has ever had. And I think academics on the right and on the left, policy experts at think tanks that are conservative or more liberal. My area of expertise is the study of Canadian and American think tanks, generally agree that one of the major problems that the President encountered was his unwillingness to embrace different opinions from people either in the White House, but more importantly, outside the White House. I think that is going to have to change. Even great powers can benefit from the advice of those less powerful. My suggestion, and in conclusion, is that the future President needs to embrace, not resist, neighborly advice, even if it is critical. Only then can we strengthen our bilateral relationship. Only then can America restore its rightful place in what has become a more precarious world order. Thank you very much.
Well, like my fellow panelists, my thanks to the Wilson Center for the invitation, bringing us together. It's the fourth edition publication of Professors Thompson and Randall's book, Canada, the United States, Ambivalent Allies. I have a great deal of experience with using this book. I've used it since the first edition in the classroom, and in a sense, I guess my voice can be one as a field tester, and I'm an historian, as David noted at the outset. Now, we've been asked to briefly address some themes raised in Ambivalent Allies, perhaps talk a bit about the ways in which some of those themes, those enduring themes in the Canadian-American relationship, are shaping the presidential race in the United States or the parliamentary elections in Canada that are ongoing right now. And perhaps, if we want to be so bold, to make some predictions, as Don just did a little bit, about the ways in which the relationship will unfold in the 21st century. Now, it's axiomatic that historians, no matter how essential we think we are in our work for trying to improve the intellectual well-being of our fellow humans, make wretched prognosticators. Or at least I do. In 1995, on the eve of the famous and razor-thin Second Sovereignty Association vote in Quebec, I confidently predicted on a talk show in Montreal that the PQ, or the Parti Québécois' agenda, would be soundly trounced. They weren't. I haven't returned to a talk show since, and of course I wasn't invited back. Nonetheless, I have spent a career thinking about the Canadian-American relationship, working with students on it, both graduate and undergraduate. And so just for my few minutes this morning, I thought it might be useful to touch on a couple of themes. One has to do with nationalism and certainly national identity. The other has to do with borders and sovereignty, which Don has already touched on, and resources. And in particular, I'll have sort of a water focus today. I come from Maine, which has very much a maritime focus, small m, and of course neighbors with the Atlantic region of Canada. So for nationalism, I thought it might be useful, and once again, I think some of these points we're all making are geared to the discussion period, which will be coming in a few minutes, to throw some ideas out. There's no question that there has been essentially a cottage industry in Canada for a long time, considering the national and cultural distinctions Canadians and Americans. And this ranges from certainly a fair number of Canadian scholars and pundits engaging in what Sigmund Freud might once referenced as the narcissism of small differences. So you have on the one hand, this is incredibly detailed, nuanced understanding of the difference between Canadians and Americans. And then on the other hand, to go to the other extreme, you have certainly a fair number of scholars, including certainly I think most famously sociologist Seymour Martin Lipset with Continental Divide, with these ideas of these very stark differences between Canadians and Americans. So how to make this a little relevant to what is going on, I just thought I'd maybe make this observation, boning up for this moment on the panel. I was certainly spending some time Googling things, and understanding the ways in which, I think what might be useful for the discussion period is understanding the ways in which Prime Minister Stephen Harper comes from a long line of political figures in Canada, walking an extremely fine line, and this is well done, of course, in Ambivalent Allies. This fine line of, on the one hand, clearly demonstrating Canada's support for the United States on a host of issues, certainly ranging from trade and currently through strategic issues and boundary issues to the war in Afghanistan. And at the same time, the delicate dance, of course, as those of us who study this relationship know full well, is not to be too close to the Americans and send a signal that you are going to bring Canada too much into the American sphere of influence. I think something that's very fascinating, and I'd be more than happy to talk about it in the question period and see what my fellow panelists have to say about this. And I'll just throw this out because it's interesting. I think that if you believe polls, Canadians poll very favorably, Don mentioned this, very, very favorably for Barack Obama. But that does not necessarily translate, and Stephen Harper is working very hard on this, and I think fairly effectively, that doesn't necessarily translate to a liberal victory. It doesn't, just because a very large number of Canadian citizens have a favorable opinion of Barack Obama and maybe the Democratic agenda, won't necessarily translate to a conservative majority in this forthcoming election. That's kind of interesting, and what we make of that, we certainly, you can see Prime Minister Stephen Harper engaging, and once again, he comes from a very long line of prime ministers engaging this very delicate dance of showing support for the United States at the same time carving out stark boundaries. And on that point, my second for a couple of minutes, and Don already talked about, scoop me on one point, and that's fine, on Arctic sovereignty. I think the water borderlands will be very much on the front burner for the 21st century. Now, certainly, and probably many people in this room have a great deal of interest in security issues that are certainly ongoing between the United States and Canada. The land border. I just thought it might be useful to also, and Don's already done with the Arctic sovereignty, and certainly this was done fairly well, I think very well in the book, thinking about the ways in which water borderlands are going to be front and center in the 21st century. And so just a quick, so the Arctic issue has been raised. I thought I'd bring something down from Maine or from my neck of the borderlands woods, and some of you might be familiar with it, but there's certainly this pales in a global context. This pales. Most people wouldn't even find this on the back. You might have to go to page 28 to find it in any newspaper. But there is a fairly heated issue in the Maine-New Brunswick boundary having to do with liquefied natural gas, which Maine is a poor state, a relatively poor state. It's constantly trying to find ways to basically make money in the modern world. And one theme that has been hatched, or idea that has been hatched, is to use an easternmost port in the United States at Eastport, Maine, and to have liquefied natural gas tankers, these massive tankers, size of a football field, an American football field, that is, basically coming through a very tricky passage, unload their cargo, and that cargo would become natural gas for American markets. The trick is this. If this comes to fruition, those super tankers essentially would have to come through Canadian waterways. And this is a very tricky passage. It's a place called Passamaquoddy Bay, if you're interested. And it's a very tricky passage. And the Canadians, both locally in New Brunswick, fully supported by the federal government in Canada, have essentially said no, or they want to study the issue because this is potentially, obviously, these are large tankers. They're full of liquefied natural gas. There's potentially, great hazard and what have you. And once again, these are very tricky passages. So you have this new, fairly local issue here of just how important this boundary still is. This is the water boundary, and then, of course, the Arctic, and with the ice melting and what have you, the question of international passage, fair passage, and also exploration of resources in the Arctic, and some pundits have already called it the cold rush, is on for the Arctic, and this certainly involves international players. My final theme on the water focus is picking up on those wonderful themes that are throughout ambivalent allies having to do with the role of staples, as we often call it, and I'm thinking about Canadian and American history, are resources. And certainly it's no news that very much on the front burner nowadays would be oil and natural gas, fossil fuels. It's also interesting to think, and certainly John and Steve, I think, nicely addressed this, that increasingly the issue of fresh water is certainly thought of globally, and it's going to be, I think, very much a factor for thinking about the Canadian-American relationship in the 21st century. Depending on who you read, Canada has probably roughly 7% of the world's renewable fresh water, only behind Brazil and Russia and China, depending, once again, the order depends on which source you're looking at. But nonetheless, it's a very significant percentage of the world's renewable fresh water. The question of bulk fresh water export from Canada to the United States has already been raised, and it comes from the mildly amusing to the alarmist. Mildly amusing would be Arizona politicians who periodically, Arizona is a fairly hot place and a fairly thirsty place and burgeoning in population. So Arizona politicians periodically put it out there that, well, you Canadians have a heck of a lot of water and there aren't many of you, so why don't you just ship some down? Obviously, this gets a pretty significant reaction in Canada, and certainly Canadian. And then to the serious, the idea of bulk water transport and whether or not NAFTA has a role in this, whether this is fair game through under the rubric of NAFTA, opens up all sorts of serious and interesting questions. So I think fresh water is very much going to be a factor of the 21st century. We're very much focused on fossil fuels right now, as well we should be, but keep your eye on the water. So these are a couple of points quickly sketched about the current Canadian-American relationship that I think I hope they'll be useful for a forthcoming discussion when we open the session to questions and observations from all of you. I do want to conclude. That's one reason why I wanted to go last. I want to conclude by taking the opportunity to return to the raison d'etre for bringing this panel together, which is the book launch of the 4th edition of Canada and the United States, Ambivalent Allies. Now, at the beginning of the session, in a little fit of full disclosure, it's the political season, of course, I noticed that I was a pretty poor predictor of the future. But I've been teaching for almost a quarter century now, and I do have a handful of successes under my belt, and happily one is relevant to today's proceedings. I was invited by the Journal of American History to write a review of Ambivalent Allies when it was first published. And I want to read from that review just a couple of lines from 1995. With their sights fixed in covering over 200 years of history, Thompson and Randall have succeeded magnificently in making the appropriate editorial calls of inclusion and emphasis. They present the important historiographical arguments with acumen. They step well beyond exploring the machinations of presidents and prime ministers to provide a compelling history of one of the closest international relationships in the world. This is an important book that promises to become the standard in the field. It should be an obligatory first stop for those interested in understanding the generally amicable and complex Canadian-American relationship. And without a touch of smugness, I suggest that truer words were never written. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we go to questions, I want to flip it back to John and Steve to see if they want to add anything, and then we'll open it up to everybody here.
Just a very, very quick comment on Scott's identification of some of the critical issues. You mentioned water and water borderlands. I think you're absolutely correct, and your prediction on this one will be much more accurate than it was on the referendum. The U.S. Institute, in collaboration with the Canada Institute, last fall hosted a conference on transboundary water issues with a focus on Western North America. And it was quite clear, I think, from the presenters and the discussion at that conference of how critical water is going to be, not just in the bilateral relationship, but frankly, much more generally. Henry Vaux, an economist, from Berkeley pointed out something really very striking at the conference, and that is when you look at the areas of fastest population growth in the United States, are also and this is true, frankly, of Alberta as well, and to some extent Saskatchewan. The areas of highest population growth in the Southwest are also areas of serious aridity. And it's going to be something that goes well beyond simply the border question, I think. This is also true of the Arctic, where it's not just a water issue. It clearly is a question that relates to environmental concerns. And there may well be a fundamental difference, coming back to your both of your point and also Don's, a fundamental difference over the way in which the Arctic is developed, given the sensitivity of the environmental region that is involved. Canada is quite isolated in its position on Arctic sovereignty, as I think many of you in this room will know. It's not just the United States that disagrees with the Canadian position. It's essentially every circumpolar country, including Russia and some other countries like China. Certainly the Scandinavian countries are not in agreement with the Canadian position. So that's going to be a very interesting issue, I think, to watch over the next while. It's not just a bilateral question as well. I was fascinated to hear your comments, Scott, on what's happening on the Maine-New Brunswick border, since that, of course, takes us well back into the 19th century as well. So thank you very much for those comments. Very interesting.
I want to thank you both, too. You were very kind to us, much kinder than Steve was, actually. But
dinner's coming, John.
I'm struck that the three of them still, and I try never to use this expression, the expression Canadian-American relations. And you'll notice, if you have a copy of the first edition, that I've been systematically undermining Canadian-American relations, and the book mostly uses U.S.-Canada relations. Mm-hmm. And the reason I try to do that is to remind Canadians, I think Americans already know this, that the ability of Canadians to shape the relationship is limited, and that's one of the reasons Canadians have to work so hard at it, because they have to do the best making the very small levers that they have work in their advantage. I thought about the big themes in the books, and I think the world systems idea still works. For one thing, one of the differences between our book and other books is we emphasized how much membership in the British Empire continued to matter for Canada, not just psychologically, but also in very practical ways right into the 1950s. And so I don't think we're going to be abandoning the world, or at least our genuflection in the direction of world systems.
Thanks, John. I'll take that under advisement.
I
agree.
I agree very strongly with Steve in terms of we've basically lampooned the special relationship. I have a list of countries. Turkey has a special relationship with the United States. I mean, it's fun. And now with Google, of course, you can find special relationships everywhere. I mean, there's just about nobody. Of course, what's happening is I'm beginning to think that people don't want special relationships with the United States to the same extent that they did at one time. Don made the point about the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative, and he said something that I think is a theme that has remained constant through all four editions. He said, it's an issue that won't go away no matter who occupies the White House. And one of the points we wanted to make was, let's not exaggerate prime ministerial presidential amity or discord. And Chris Sands is nodding, and I know he and I have talked about this. There were editors in Alberta who suggested that if Mr. Chrétien had been nicer to President Bush, mad cow never would have been an issue, and Americans would have just kept chowing down. Seriously, I mean, we quote one of the editors in the new edition. The last thing I wanted to talk about is this notion of the relative interest that each country takes in the other. And of course, we have to break this down. Don used the specific example of the Academy and talked about how many Canadian studies centers there are in the United States as compared to how many U.S. studies centers there are in Canada. And it's really true. His center is admirable and productive and not copied in many other universities. But it's a bit of a statistical mirage because, of course, a lot of our Canadian studies centers in the United States are one or two person operations with a course in literature canadienne française and maybe part of a course about the environment. I used to joke at one time our center was much larger and more robust than it is. And even then I used to joke that, being the best Canadian Studies Center in the United States was like being the best curling rink in Zimbabwe. But if we look into the disciplines in Canada, if we look inside political science, history, literature, you'll see that the United States is studied, but it hasn't tended to be studied from an area studies perspective. There would not be a substantial history department in Canada that wouldn't have. The University of Toronto, with the big history department, has half a dozen people who study the United States, who are historians of the United States. I don't know how many people are on the Association for Canadian Studies in the United States list as historians of Canada, but there are more historians, many more historians of the United States in Canada than there are historians of Canada in the United States. But Canada's, last thing, Canada's profile, and I track it, and I track it crudely. I track it by monitoring the press, which of course is easier to do now. Canada's profile in the United States has definitely increased since we published the first edition of Ambivalent Allies. And I'm not attributing a causal relationship here. There is a correlation, but I'm not attributing it as a cause. A whole new group of people in the United States who never thought about Canada have discovered it, and that is the American political right. Right-wing journalists, Bill O'Reilly, regularly appear. I was struck you made a comment about the importance of people who could bridge U.S.-Canada, and of course we have on one of the tickets an expert on bridges, and perhaps that is what we should all look forward to. It's routine now for this notion of Canada as Soviet Canuckistan, and the famous National Review cover that showed the Royal Canadian Mounted Police with the big cap underneath wimps. And now apparently a Canadian journalist, a woman from Toronto named Heather Malik, who writes a weekly column which is jejune anti-Americanism of the worst sort. But she's been picked up. She wrote a column about Sarah Palin's nomination and said, and I'm putting this is all in quotations, she said that Sarah Palin was an attempt by the Republicans to reach out to the white trash vote. And of course, I come from North Carolina. We're sensitive about phrases like that. And this has, in the right-wing blogosphere and our journals, this woman has been calumnized. Well, how can you calumnize someone who says something as stupid as that? She has become a target, so that there's an awareness of Canada that just wasn't there anymore. When I moved to the United States in the late 1980s, I'd often be invited to places to speak about Canada. And I would start my presentation by saying something like, Canada's a lot like the United States, but there are certain fundamental, subtle differences. And now I just say, well, Canada, it's the country where gay people can get married and smoke dope at the wedding reception. And 3 more editions. By the time of the 7th edition, who knows? You may have to get a bigger hall. Thank you. And thank you too.
Okay, questions? We have microphones here, and I would ask you to please speak into the microphone because we're being recorded. Jim, and then Chuck, and then Mary Ann.
Thanks very much, gentlemen. It was. I have not had the opportunity yet to read the book, which I'll look forward to after purchasing it.
Get that man's name.
But I want to make one comment and then one question to you, having not read the book. It never ceases to amaze me in Canada-U.S. relations, especially when there's a new president, the angst and Gordian knots that Canadian officials go through to try and be the first visiting head of state or head of government to a new president. That started to get a little tricky with W. Bush. And so it'll be interesting when you talk about the lampooning of the special relationship, how that in fact shakes out. The other is a little more serious, and I don't know if you address this in the book. It's concerned me over the last number of years that there's an increase in a younger, more diverse members of the Senate and Congress in the United States that really do not have, or little, of the historical context of the Canada-U.S. relationship. And I think that has a devastating impact on their understanding of the relationship as we go forward. Now, I don't know if you've addressed this, but I'd be interested in your thoughts of, again, the role of Congress and the Senate in foreign policy, Canada-U.S. relations.
wants to take a series of questions or respond to each one?
Well, I've just been thinking about, thank you. I've been reflecting on the origins of the success of this book in the classroom, which is really quite striking. And it seems to me that part of the reason is that you have given attention to some theoretical issues or patterns that really appeal to those who are historians or historically oriented, and at least as strongly for those who are on the political science side, the fact that you carefully document the historical background. That's invaluable for political science courses. In addition, it's a very well written book, so that's helpful. But my question to you is this. If you think about this, not just in terms of issues, but in terms of themes of change, what has really changed in your judgment about international relations? I mean, about the Canada-U.S. relations. What is it that stands out, if anything, in terms of a theme of change? And on the other side, what is it in terms of a theme that seems to continually return, almost in a cyclical kind of sense, and is always with us, regardless of whether we would like that to be true or not?
You want to respond?
Marianne?
Wasn't sure if we were waiting for an answer.
No, go ahead.
Okay. And again, like Jim, I apologize. I haven't read the book yet, so I'm not sure if you go into this in the book. But it strikes me, and even on the topic of change, that one of the key things that has changed is the strength and the development of provincial leaders and the provincial centers of power and the influence they are having on Canada-U.S. relations. And I think this is very key and is very instructive for the future, because I think the areas where Canada has had some strength in trying to determine an agenda or try to set a course for the relationship has been frequently led by provinces and often provincial state initiatives. WHTI is a crucial example of this, where an initiative that was initially scoffed at by both Department of Homeland Security, and scoffed would not be the right word for the Canadian side, but I think a bit ambivalent, to use that word, about whether this was the route to go. But it was the development of enhanced driver's licenses was very much pushed by Washington State and British Columbia. And there's now huge uptake now. Department of Homeland Security is touting this as their preferred document of choice. So I think in Canada in particular, where arguably our premiers are stronger than U.S. governors, and we can have some influence on that relationship, and we should be looking at that in terms of resources, energy issues, water. There's several areas where Canada could start harnessing that power to set an agenda for the U.S. Secondly, I'm curious this topic about Canadian Studies Centres in the U.S. versus American Studies Centres in the U.S. And I'm wondering if you have the statistics on how many of the students that study at the Canadian centres in the U.S. are actually Canadian. When I graduated from my master's at Queen's University, 3 of my co-students continued on to do PhDs in Canadian studies at American universities, but they were Canadian. So I'm curious who's kind of leading that initiative in the U.S. And then thirdly, and I'm not sure if I have Heather Malik to thank for the problem that I'm currently facing. Yeah. I'm a Canadian who lives here. I've lived here for 11 years. And the whole notion of if we're different or the same or whatever, I recently on the soccer field sidelines chatting with a co-soccer mom who I had many conversations with over 2 years. And I arrived late for one game and sort of exhausted, said I had spent the day in a room with a bunch of former ambassadors to Canada and Canadian ambassadors to the United States, so I could really use a martini if anybody had one. And she looked at me and she said, "Whoa, that must have been rough because those Canadians are a bunch of weirdos." And I just said,
the profile it's increasing.
and I just looked, I said, "Wow." I said, "Well, you're talking to one, and you've been talking to one for 2 years, and all this time you thought I was just like you." So, a lot of comment there, and but I'm curious in particular on the provincial relations.
We better start responding, and I'll take the last one about the number of people who study Canada in the United States who are actually expat Canadians. I have no concrete data, but my guess would be an overwhelming percentage, like myself, are former Canadians who can sometimes. I don't know if I can pass to the extent that you can pass, though. I'm not sure if I try to say research and project instead of project, but I sometimes I slip, and I think I've lost I can say about without saying about, but it is tricky. In our program, most of the students who take undergraduate courses about Canada are Americans, because most of our students are Americans. And as one, Duke's, of course, an expensive private university, and as one of the wealthy young women from Vancouver who was a member of Delta, I met her at a party, and she said, I was the gentleman who thought about Canada, and she said she wasn't going to take that. One of the reasons her parents had sent her to Duke was so she wouldn't have to study with people like me. So, but I don't know that we've counted. It would be an interesting thing. It's been some years. Access periodically does studies on Canadian studies, and I don't know. What seems to be happening now is that the Canadian studies as a discipline area in Canada, the Canadian Association seems to be dying. And there's been a major influx of Canadians into the the Association for Canadian Studies in the United States. And I believe the ACS-US has decided to have it every second biennial in Canada. So we may be seeing the emergence of a non-governmental continental subsystem that will study Canada in both countries. I hope a few Americans that we're able to conceal ourselves well enough to lure a few Americans into it with martinis and altered accents.
I was just going to add just two comments. One in response to John. He's absolutely right that there are a number of Canadian scholars who study different aspects of the United States in history departments, in political science departments, sociology departments, etc. But what's interesting is even at the University of Toronto, where I graduated from many, many years ago, you were hard-pressed to find more than introductory level courses in American politics. So you'd have one at the second-year level, and perhaps an American foreign policy course at one of Canada's largest and most prestigious universities. But many other universities around the country, again, you would be hard-pressed to find anything offered at an advanced level. We've been fortunate at Western, and not to be a spokesperson for Western, although often they want me to be, we have a critical mass of people in history, in politics, in sociology, in English, in geography, whose primary area of interest is the United States. That's what has allowed us to harness the energy of all of these faculty to promote American studies on campus. And given all of the political interest in the United States over the last number of years, we have a huge market for students, both Canadian and American, studying at Western to take American studies. Our enrollment, our program has only been going for 4 years, our undergraduate program. We started off with 18 students. This year we have 125. So it has just taken off. There are some great universities in Quebec, the University of Quebec in Montreal, that has a wonderful foreign policy focus on the United States. But when you go across the country, there are just really a handful of schools that are beginning to think more systematically about how to make American studies an area of concentration and how to offer students more insight into the relationship between the two countries. I have friends who teach in the United States, Canadians, one at Southern Methodist, one at USC, but I too would be interested in the statistics, looking at how many Canadian scholars have moved to the United States to head up Canadian studies programs. But I I would say of all of our students, probably about 30% are American-born.
There's some very, very good questions that have been raised. Anecdote to start with. There are very few Canadian-born and Canadian-trained specialist historians who work on the United States. I think there are probably 2 of us in Canada, myself being one of them. My wife's a dual citizen. And the anecdote is that when we were applying for our Nexus card so that we could travel back and forth more easily through those large lines in Toronto, the Homeland Security chap, less of concern to the Canadian Immigration and Customs official, but the Homeland Security person said, well, you're American. Why didn't you go back to the United States after you finished your graduate degree? He simply could not understand why she would have stayed in Canada. And he said, I understand the academic market's beginning to open up a little bit more. My wife's in her late 50s. And perhaps you'll be able to go back. The implication being you wouldn't possibly want to live in Canada if you had a choice between the two. I also did my degree at the University of Toronto, but I did do my political science work with Jean Edward Smith. This was in the days when, because Jean Edward Smith had worked in the Pentagon at an earlier stage, this was at a period in the late 1960s when the SDS was boycotting his classes. So things have changed. That's one of the things that has changed. I think there is a little less anti-Americanism in the Canadian context now. The role of members of Congress, your question, I think it's related to some extent to what Don was saying as well, and that's the very close trade and economic relationship with the border states, but also to that add California. Most of California's natural gas energy comes, of course, from Alberta, and that raises, I think, the other point that was made by someone, and that is the role of provincial leaders. This is a constitutional issue as well. Energy is, after all, a provincial, within the provincial jurisdiction. And consequently, the role of premiers, and especially in the case of Alberta and Saskatchewan, because of energy, those provincial premiers are going to have to play a more significant role. There's a comment that Derek Burney makes in his autobiography, which some of you in the room will be familiar with. When Peter Lougheed was Premier of Alberta, Gottlieb said that he was about the only Premier that he felt comfortable letting loose in Congress. And that is an issue. There's a political dimension there that the federal government obviously wants to contain to some degree. John Manley, shortly after he was Canadian Foreign Minister, at a conference of the Canadian Institute for International Affairs, which has been renamed the Canadian International Council, I guess it is, David, isn't it now, with Jim Basilia money. That's another issue, which we can get into if you want. And that's what's happening to the study of international relations and Canadian foreign policy in Canada, the institutionalization of it to some extent. But there's no question that the role of provincial leaders is going to become more important. I think it already has. The example of the Washington, British Columbia instance with respect to identification certificates is a very good case in point. But it is a constitutional question as well, where energy is concerned. There's no doubt. But John Manley commented at that conference, when asked the question, what is the role of the province or of the provinces in Canadian foreign policy, his response was zero. They have no business in the shaping of Canadian foreign policy. Now, Manley's wrong. He's wrong. It depends on how you define foreign policy. Mm-hmm. I think he really missed the boat on that. The question of, again, on the role of members of Congress, it's absolutely critical. The key committee members in the U.S. Congress, less so, I think, on the Canadian Parliament side, and it is a reflection of the differences between the role of Parliament and the role of Congress. Canadian diplomats and politicians need to know and to work closely with key committee chairs in the U.S. Congress. I think Gottlieb recognized that in the 80s. I think Derek Burney continued to do that in the late 80s and early 90s when he was ambassador as well, and I'm sure Michael Wilson's doing exactly the same thing today. The issue of what has changed in the Canada-U.S. relationship and what are the continuities. I mean, it's a really interesting question, and I think others may be better able to answer this. I think one word I would use is maturity. I think there is. It's reflected in a couple of the comments that were made, certainly by the commentators today. I think there's more maturity on the Canadian side than there once was. This is, of course, because the University of Calgary trained our current Prime Minister. And it also trained his chief of staff, who had to resign over the NAFTA issue and Obama. But that's another issue. We don't take responsibility for that. And I personally don't take any responsibility for our Prime Minister, but that's another issue. He was trained by my economist colleagues, not by the political scientists. In spite of this mythology that's out there, that he was trained by the Calgary School, the right-wing group in the political science department.
These are all from Duke. Conspiracy.
They're all from Duke, that's right. He wasn't trained by them. He was trained by Bob Mansell in the economics department. That is never mentioned in the newspapers at all. And when I first went to Calgary from McGill, John and I left McGill about the same time for different reasons. When I first went, Bob Mansell, this would have been about 1989, invited me to lunch with somebody. And he said, I want you to meet someone. And so we sat down at lunch, and it was Stephen Harper, and he said, I want you to meet Harper because he's going to be Prime Minister. That was in 1989, a frightening thought, and his predictions were more accurate than yours on the referendum, Scott, in that regard. What has changed? I do think maturity on the Canadian side is coming, and it's reflected in Harper's approach on the whole. The comment that's been made that he's had to walk a very, very fine tightrope, a very fine line between supporting the U.S. but still defending Canadian sovereignty, I think is a very, very accurate comment. There is this lingering grassroots sensitivity to American power, which makes it essential that any Canadian Prime Minister walk that line. So you back off from virulent anti-Americanism, but you still have to be cautious. That's a continuity, but I think the maturity is part of the changing relationship. There are going to be areas of tension, there's no doubt. Arctic sovereignty will be one of them, and I think water, which you've identified, is going to be another. I think energy more broadly defined will become an issue. The question of dirty oil, which is in the U.S. Congress, before the U.S. Congress now, is going to be an issue on which you're going to see Canadian and particularly Alberta politicians lobbying because we do have dirty oil. There's no question that what's coming out of Fort McMurray from the bitumen is dirty oil. But it's also having a very significant impact on water usage in Alberta, something that gets perhaps a little less into the media than it might. And it will have an impact on the capacity, of course, of the province to survive. Because there's only a limited amount of water. It's being used for agriculture, for personal consumption, and it's being used in huge quantities for the oil industry with the extraction of bitumen from the tar sands. So very, very interesting questions. I may have missed one, but thank you. They were very good points.
Picking up on a couple of the points that have just been made and these very good questions, I think that, of course, I'm not an author of your book, but I think you do a very good job of picking up on themes, working themes that have to do with that. It's almost overwrought now and problematic, but the globalization. There's no question that understanding Canada and the United States cannot be done now unless you are thinking much well beyond the borders of the two countries. And certainly there you come, you're in a long line of very careful scholars reaching back to individuals who worked in the Carnegie series in the early to mid 20th century, and John Bartlett Brebner published the famous North Atlantic Triangle, and thereby coming up with a model in 1945, which sort of gets out of just understanding the bilateral relationship. So I don't think I'm not sure what globalization means. I know it's problematic, but there's no question that you're already pushing in that direction. I think in your fourth edition that understanding Canada and the United States cannot be done without understanding without understanding much larger dynamics. I do want to return to I think that these really excellent points about the ways in which premiers, and I would say governors in the United States can very much push agendas. That little case study that I had about the LNG issue has very much to do with a New Brunswick premier, Sean Graham, pushing that agenda, and this Southwestern member of Parliament pushing that agenda on behalf of New Brunswick, and it very much became a national agenda as well. And certainly the governor of the state of Maine, hardly a heavy hitter, the state in the United States, but Governor Baldacci very much pushed his agenda for having the LNG tankers and got some traction in the Capitol in Washington. I was just had this thought of sort of throw it out. I think this is a variation on a theme which is enduring, and perhaps endearing, and certainly is understanding Canada and also the United States of regionalism. I mean, and certainly I think both of you do a very good job of that throughout your editions, is that there is a regional nature to the relationship as well. And those of us who study Canadian history are quite familiar with understanding or challenging the idea of understanding Canadian history as regions or an archipelago, as one scholar long ago called Canada an archipelago, nation basically of pockets of people and highly regionalized in their orientation. But I do think that it is an interesting, and it's raised by that question of, certainly ways in which premiers very much have a role. Governors can have a role, but the east to west, tracking against the continent, there are very profound distinctions with population groups and in the relationships. And I just purely out of anecdotally, and this is dated now, but I remember reading something at least a decade ago where, for example, Albertans poll very high about their view of the United States, or Americans at least, and whereas in other parts of Canada, you'll find almost the opposite kind of response to a poll. Now, I know that's anecdotal, and a poll is a poll, but there are important nuances in the relationship, of course, reaching from the Pacific Northwest to the eastern seaboard. So that's just it's another way of getting at just you try to capture the theme of Canada and the United States, and the more you get into it, as our authors have, the more you find that you've got another edition coming, probably.
Chuck has the really... I'm sorry, Don.
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
Chuck has the really hard question, of course, what's changed and what remains constant, and it depends what you choose as your time frame. The striking thing is that Canadians, what do they say, they're the world's oldest anti-Americans, and they remain anti-American. But it's astonishing how the content, for example, of a Canadian anti-American diatribe has changed. Canadians now, I don't know how many of you go to Government of Canada websites. The specialty on a Government of Canada website is opening with a picture of an Aboriginal child with big brown eyes. And Canadians celebrate their multiculturalism and their connection with Indigenous peoples. In the late 19th century, a Canadian would have criticized the United States for being mongrel, for attracting immigrants from all over Europe. Now they celebrate this, and it's interesting how these things can sort of slip and slide. The fundamental notion that Canadians are different remains, but the explanation that they offer themselves almost seamlessly changes over time. The thing that has struck me, Scott mentioned Seymour Martin Lipset, who used the analogy of two trains that started out on parallel tracks and ran into the future and have remained apart. But Steve and I didn't find that at all. We, in fact, find that the countries zig and zag, and sometimes the trains almost looks like they're going to collide, and other times they swing apart. And one of the things that has changed is the way in which people are prepared to use their governments. I mean, it's exciting to watch. Are we going to have a $700 billion bailout or not? I can hardly wait for this to be over so I can stand in front of a CNN screen and see what's happening. But this notion that the United States has somehow been a country that hasn't used government and Canada has a country that has is something that happened in the 20th century. If you had said to someone in 1950, well, Canada has a well-developed welfare state and the United States is primitive, people would have said, lie down a little while, have a glass of water. The United States had a very well-developed social security system, a complex trade union movement. And so that these things have changed in our lifetimes, in the 1960s. The thing that interests me now most is that Canadians seem to have got past they don't know that they've got past it, but Canadians have become bellicose, belligerent nationalists in a way that I don't recognize when I used to live there. I'll go back to Canada on Dominion Day, and their faces will be painted, and there'll be Technicolor yawns as they celebrate Canada and give the United States the finger, and it's the New Jersey salute. Only they've adopted it in Canada, and it didn't happen when I was a lad there. Dominion Day was a quiet little celebration. We used to play a little baseball. We stepped up to the plate and did things like that. Ate ice cream, and now Maclean's publishes an issue that's timed for Canada Day and the 4th of July. And this year's cover shows the Canadian. I posted it on my door and put underneath, I gave up my Molson birthright for a mess of Budweiser pottage. But it shows it shows a Canadian he's really buff, and he's standing in his what seems to be his backyard drinking from a Molson, Canadian. And on the other side, there's a harried American with his stars and stripes tie, and he's balding and getting heavy, and they say Canadians, we're sexier, we're richer, we're this and we're that and the other, and that's not the Canada that I knew. So, what I'd say this reflects. Steve is confident that at the diplomatic level things are handled maturely, but the ability to stir up this kind of bellicosity about the United States, I find really puzzling. I don't remember it, and it seems to be new.
I was just going to make a few additional points in my hope that there will be a 5th and 6th edition. One of the things that we haven't talked about, but I think it is particularly relevant with respect to issues like border security, the NAFTA, and could conceivably be with Arctic sovereignty, is the role that non-governmental organizations play in working in close cooperation with the United States, with Canada, to advance particular causes. And if you go back to the NAFTA negotiations, President Bush negotiated it, but President Clinton ended up having it implemented. The key role that NGOs in Canada and the United States played in getting environmental and labor issues onto the agenda. So that's something we might want to think about, and you can kind of use that as a segue into a larger discussion about the role that Congress plays, and the fact that perhaps Canadian policymakers have more success by tying into grassroots movements or supporting them than they do in face-to-face negotiations with their counterparts. The issue of walking a fine line, you talked about Stephen Harper walking a fine line. There's no question about it, especially with respect to the war on terror and support for Afghanistan, but not becoming involved in Iraq. It reminds me even of Thomas Mann's book from the Brookings Institution, but A Question of Balance, that Canadians really, we want our cake and we want to eat it too. We want to be close to the United States, but not that close, for fear that it will have political repercussions at home. I think that is a constant. So whether we have a majority government or another minority government, the idea of walking a fine line, this question of balance, we are both sovereign nations. So the idea that this special relationship that you challenge consumes everything else simply is not the case, because there are important political issues at home. And the last thing I would just mention, for those of you who are interested in issues of anti-Americanism or how it plays out in different countries, I was part of a project in Budapest a few years ago. The book has just come out, called The Political Consequences of Anti-Americanism. And there's a very interesting chapter by Kim Richard Nossel at Queen's University on Canadian anti-Americanism, published by Routledge. And what was interesting about the project was the different forms of anti-Americanism that emerge in different parts of the world. And I would certainly encourage you to look at Kim Richard Nossel's piece to try and shed some light on the discussion that we've had. But it's a very interesting. I agree with John that things have changed a whole lot in Canada. Things have matured, but in terms of the bellicosity, I think certainly with respect to certain issues, not only has it been revved up, but it has become more palatable, and which is obviously a concern to many of us in the room.
One thing we haven't talked about really at all is defense collaboration. And given the current international environment, it's actually one of the key areas. Canada's commitment to Afghanistan, to the anti-Taliban conflict in Afghanistan, is politically sensitive in the Canadian context. There is a commitment to stay there until 2011. As well. Whether it's a popular decision or not, I don't know. It's a popular decision in Alberta. It comes back to your point, Scott, on regionalism, very strongly supported in the Alberta context. But when you look at the level of collaboration, again, I think we bring this down from the political level and you look at the actual operational level. The degree of collaboration on a military level between Canada and the United States since 1945 has been extremely high, and not just in the context of NORAD, but in terms of interoperational capacity as well. It's one of the reasons why I do think we have to keep things sometimes in our discussion below the political level, because that's what's happening on a day-to-day basis. So I'll stop at that stage as well.
Oakley and then Mildred.
Morning. I work for a large Canadian manufacturer here in Washington. I'm the Washington guy. And I wanted to just make 2 points, perhaps put some meat on the bones about dealing with Congress. And I don't know whether there's somebody here from the Canadian Embassy who might want to comment further. But since Michael Wilson has come, the Embassy has instituted a twice-a-year program which they call All Politics is Local. And they bring in all 14 consuls general that are based around the United States, and together with companies such as mine that has operations throughout the United States, we go and visit with, it's usually more than 50 members of Congress, on both Senate and House, to promote the fact that there is this trade that goes back and forth in the jobs. So whereas, yes, there's $1.5 billion a day, in addition, specifically in your district or in your states, this is how many jobs depend on that trade. And I think it's been very effective. And there are also the Congressional Friends of Canada, Congressman Henry Brown from South Carolina, who's developed that caucus. It has, I think, 60 members. So, again, Michael Wilson has really put a big push on that, and I think it's very effective, and we're happy to participate in that. So, again, just some meat on that particular bones. The other comment I'd like to make is, and it's perhaps more than anecdotal, and again, there's $1.5 billion every day, so what we do isn't necessarily going to affect it. But our aviation interests, and we sell both business aircraft and regional aircraft, whereas we used to sell 70% of our product, and those are airplanes made in Canada and also made in the United States, to the United States. We're now down to about 30% of our aircraft go to the United States, and that's a product of not only the United States customers not having as much money, both individuals and airlines, but also the growth in the rest of the world. On the rail side, it's just 4 or 5% of our business. You know, the United States is just not a rail customer. But what I've noticed, and the point I'd make, is even within our own company, people just don't talk about the United States as much. And particularly with respect to Washington, where I'm looking for resources to do things in Washington, there's a reluctance to put additional resources into doing things in Washington. So not that we're turning our backs on Washington, but we're putting those resources in Russia and China and India. So again, this is just one company. But whereas it was always, what do the Americans think about us? What should we do about the American market? We moved away from that and put our emphasis on these other parts of the world. And America, at least in our company, while it's still important, I mean, 30% of your aviation market is no small amount. Still, there's a very definite change in emphasis that we've seen. So, good. Thanks.
I, too, have not read your new book yet, but what you were commenting about adding in your next editions, more information about the way governments in both countries work, which, excuse me, people think they're informed about, but they're not. And there have been a lot of good comments here about the provinces, about regionalism, and about the individual states. So I certainly would encourage you on that level, and you've already done a great job. The question I had was about an issue that you didn't have anything to say about, although you may have in your book, and it's one that's very important in the U.S., and certainly we're going to be hearing a lot about it, and I'm sure in the presidential debates, and that's the issue of immigration. And immigration in the two countries have certainly been handled differently up to now. And immigration in NAFTA was, compared to the European Union, certainly handled very differently. There wasn't going to be that free flow of workers across the border, and that policy certainly had very important implications for Mexican immigration into the United States. If you're familiar with Doug Massey's work, Doug talks about how as the border between the U.S. and Mexico has become less porous, it hasn't reduced the numbers of Mexicans coming into the U.S., but it's reduced the numbers going back, because before that, people would move back and forth. So it's a very important issue for U.S. politics, and I'm wondering if it has any implications for Canada-U.S. relations.
Do you want to respond?
Of course, migration is a major theme of any discussion of relationships among the three nation states that we call North America. Historically, and most people don't know this, but historically, in terms of the percentage of people who could have moved, Canada has been the principal immigrant donating country in the world to the United States. I mean, people will say, oh, why, there's more Germans and more Italians. And I'll say, absolutely, but remember how many people could go. And in 1900, the 1900 U.S. Census, and I know Mildred and I have talked about this together, in the 1900 U.S. Census, 1 in 4 people ever born in Canada lived in the United States. 1 in 4. It was estimated that the Canadian population in 1931, Canada does a census in the first year of the decade, the Canadian population was just over 8 million. It was estimated to be about 13 million if everybody had stayed in Canada and reproduced. So it's really important, but the immigration policies have diverged so massively since the 1960s. I mean, Canada has, no offense to the Canadians in the room, Canada has a really smart, cynical immigration policy that's designed to attract workers in the prime of life who make a major economic contribution to the country. Canada overall has been catching up to the United States in terms of GDP and in terms of population. The United States, on the other hand, has an immigration policy that's basically geared towards, the legal immigration policy is geared toward family reunification. So we're not bringing in the same kinds of people. And then the other people who come in illegally, we're not quite sure how many million, is it 8, 9, 10, 11, or 12, are the nice people who were kind enough to roof my wife. We have a house, and it's great for us people in the United States because they're providing a labor force. Migration from the United States to Canada, on the other hand, from Canada to the United States, has diminished massively. There have only been a few periods in Canadian history, the time that the Tories, or as the Canadians call them, the Loyalists, came, the short period from the first 12 years of the 20th century, and then during the Vietnam War. Those are the only times in the history of this continent that the net migration flow has been north. There are spectacular migrants like Sitting Bull, but I mean beyond that, and this is changing now. Canadians don't come to the United States anymore. The comment from the gentleman from, I assume it's Bombardier, that you're making fewer investments in selling things to American customers. The same, Canadians are voting with their feet. There are fewer Canadians migrating to the United States and slightly more Americans migrating to Canada, although that's trickier. the flow of migration, try this on for size. I heard Bartlett Brebner's name mentioned, and there's a wonderful book that he participated in called The Mingling of the Canadian and the American Peoples. And it's one of the most misnamed books in history because, of course, they didn't mingle. 100 Canadians per capita moved to the United States for every one American who moved to Canada. And so now it's close to being in balance. It's really quite striking. So there's one way it's going to.
Yeah, John's absolutely right. Of course, it has become an issue since 9/11, as you well know, in terms of the bilateral relationship. But the perception, an articulated perception, that Canada's immigration and refugee policy, even more particularly, was too lax. That Canada was letting into the country undesirable elements, and was not that image was not helped, of course, by a couple of the individuals who, in fact, did cross the border and were apprehended in the process. The Los Angeles bomber, of course, being a major one.
Mr. Chairman, I object. He never actually got to Los Angeles. They caught him in Port Angeles.
True enough. So John is right. The immigration policy has digressed between the two countries. The North American Free Trade Agreement was designed to facilitate professional movement as opposed to real immigration on a significant level. And I think what has happened just in the post-9/11 environment is this concern about the Mexicanization of the Canadian border in terms of movement of people. And Canadian officials have been very concerned about that particular issue, that the security would be the same on the Canadian side as it is on the Mexican. But I think we stay out of that. It's interesting. I mean, last year when I was a Fulbright scholar at American University, I taught a course in trilateral relations, U.S., Canada, Mexico. And this comes back to one of the earlier questions. There was only one student in the entire course who did a research paper that related to Canada. All of the other papers were on U.S. policy toward Mexico. Everyone. There was only one student who had and it was on missile defense. He was a military buff. And that, I think, tells us also something about what the internal dynamic is in the United States. Now, a few of those students, admittedly, were exchange students, who were Hispanic exchange students from Mexico and elsewhere. But it is, I think, a reflection of why there may be a little less interest in the Canadian side, given the changing complexion of the American population as well. And that relates to the immigration issue, both legal and illegal. I'm reminded very much of Samuel Huntington's very controversial and some respects unfortunate piece a few years ago, in which he talked about the Hispanicization of American society as a threat to core American values, as you will recall that particular piece. But this isn't entirely new. In 1970, I was going to the southern United States to do some research. It was in the middle of a blizzard in the Toronto-Windsor axis, and there was a huge tie-up across the border between Windsor and Detroit. And when I was driving the car, and when I got to the U.S. Customs and Immigration official, I asked if there was something unusual happening. Why the tie-up? And he said, "You have a lot of foreigners up there in your country, and we don't want them down here." Right. So this is not necessarily a new phenomenon, that is the border security question. It has taken on a kind of intensity in the post-9/11 environment, but it's not necessarily a new issue. I can also remember my car being taken apart when I was on my way to to work at the Herbert Hoover Library in West Branch, Iowa, about the same time, about 1969, because looking, I guess, like a graduate student in those days, I was clearly a drug trafficker. And every part of the vehicle that was easily removed was taken apart. So, border security is not a new thing. It just has taken on that new intensity.
Quick addition to the panel response to this very good question about immigration policies. I think that there's an important dynamic, and it really, the two nations, it's emblematic of their sense of their nation state, the ways in which the immigration policies play out. And so just quickly, the ways in which Canada targeted refugees or consciously targeted refugees, to my mind at least as an historian, fits very much in sort of a stylized or an ideal of Canada being, which was heavily, clearly articulated certainly in the 20th century, especially the second half of the 20th century, of being certainly a model, a great middle power and a great model for the world, so consciously targeting different refugee populations, for example. I think it's at the ways in which there's a self-identification there playing out in its immigration policies. And it's certainly the United States has over time. Its immigration policies in a way reflect what Americans think about themselves, to get the big brush out here. Very different policies.
I'm not sure. It's true that these concerns about security on the border are ancient. The idea that people from other countries could be smuggled into the United States via Canada and Mexico goes back into the late 19th century. Having been 2 hours in the line in Vancouver Airport in August, something that used to take about 10 minutes, the thickening of the border does seem to have taken place, and I'm sure there are many people here who can speak with greater expertise than I can, and I promise that we'll cite them in the next edition of, if there's another edition of Ambivalent Allies. But it's a...
Further questions? If not, then please help me thank the panel for a great discussion.
Thank you all for coming.
Yes.
Goodness gracious.